There's no disputing that the Arizona Territory bred its share of legendary gunfighters during the tumultuous years following the Civil War. Men like Deadeye, Dan McGraw, the infamous Clayton brothers, and the ruthless Jack the Viper Henderson. But perhaps no figure left a more mysterious legacy than Sarah "Ghost" Morrison, a name that would later send chills down the spines of even the most hardened outlaws. A quiet widow running a modest ranch who became death's own shadow, credited with sending 32 men to their graves who once calmly stated, "Some men mistake kindness for weakness. I simply became the consequence of their error." Join me today as we delve into the story of the woman they called the Ghost, the silent guardian of Shadow Creek Valley who proved that the deadliest predator is often the one you refuse to see coming. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches your soul, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow we've got something extra special lined up for you. Shadow Creek, Arizona Territory, spring of 1875. The town was like many others sprouting up across the frontier. A dusty main street, lined with sun-bleached buildings where hope and desperation danced together beneath the merciless desert sun. It was the kind of place where most folks minded their own business, which is exactly why Sarah Morrison chose it. She arrived on a cool March morning driving a wagon loaded with modest supplies, her black morning dress catching the desert wind. Those who witnessed her arrival would later recall two things: the wedding ring she never removed, and the fact that she spoke so softly they had to lean in close to hear her when she asked directions to the land office. The townsfolk of Shadow Creek were used to widows passing through, looking for fresh starts after the war had claimed their husbands. But something about Sarah Morrison was different. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that some mistook for fragility. Sheriff Thomas Hayes, a veteran lawman who'd seen his share of broken souls and hidden stories, watched the newcomer from his office porch. "There's two kinds of grief in this territory," he'd later write in his journal. "The kind that breaks people, and the kind that forges them into something stronger. Mrs. Morrison struck me as the latter." Dr. Elizabeth Cooper was the first to actually engage with the mysterious widow, treating a minor burn on Sarah's hand from what the woman claimed was a cooking accident. The doctor couldn't help but notice the calluses on those delicate hands, rope marks, reins marks, and something else that spoke of experience with weapons. But Cooper was a woman who understood discretion in a man's world, and the question she didn't ask spoke volumes about the respect Sarah quickly earned in the community. Within a week, Sarah had purchased the old Henderson place, 500 acres of prime grazing land nestled in a remote corner of Shadow Creek Valley. The previous owner, Marcus Henderson, had died under mysterious circumstances, leaving the property abandoned. She'd been holding out for the right buyer, turning down offers from both the notorious Carson gang and various cattle barons who'd tried to pressure her into selling. There was something in her eyes, Mary Thompson, the local store owner, would later tell the sheriff, "Something that made me feel like the land would be protected, like justice would finally find its way to Shadow Creek." She wasn't wrong about Sarah's protective nature, though she couldn't have imagined just how far that instinct would eventually reach. The widow settled into her new property with methodical precision, repairing fences, tending to a small herd of cattle, and planting a modest vegetable garden. She paid her bills promptly, attended church on Sundays, though she never sang with the congregation, and politely declined invitations to social gatherings. When spoken to, she responded with nods or the briefest of answers, earning her the local nickname Silent Sarah. Mary Thompson, whose store served as the town's unofficial gathering place, noticed peculiar details about their new neighbors' shopping habits. She always bought ammunition in small but regular quantities, explaining it away as protection against coyotes. Her eyes would linger on wanted posters, though she never commented on them, and she had an uncanny habit of positioning herself with her back to the wall, keeping the door in sight at all times. But there were other oddities that didn't escape notice. The way she seemed to appear out of nowhere when trouble stirred in town, how her eyes constantly scanned the horizon during her infrequent supply runs to Shadow Creek, and the fact that no one ever saw her without her black shawl, worn with the kind of familiarity that spoke of years of mourning. Deputy James "Rusty" Wilson, young and eager to prove himself, Once boasted at the saloon that he'd seen Sarah practicing with a revolver in the early morning hours. "Never seen anything like it," he'd whispered, face pale from the memory. 6 bottles, 60 yards, 6 shots, all in the time it takes to draw a breath. But it wasn't the speed that scared me. It was how natural it looked, like breathing. The source of Sarah's shooting prowess might have remained a mystery if not for the arrival of retired Marshal Catherine "Cat" McCall that spring. The legendary lawwoman had tracked outlaws across 3 territories before hanging up her badge, and she was sharing coffee with Sheriff Hayes when Sarah walked past the jailhouse window. McCall's hand froze midway to her cup, her weathered face turning ashen. "Lord Almighty," she breathed. "I thought she was dead." Before Sheriff Hayes could ask for clarification, fate intervened in the form of thundering hoofbeats. The Carson gang, 30 strong, had just ridden into Shadow Creek, their reputation preceding them. A trail of robbed banks, burned ranches, and murdered innocents stretching from Texas to California. And with them came the storm that would shatter the silence surrounding Sarah Ghost Morrison forever. The air grew thick with tension as James Carson's men dismounted, their spurs singing against the wooden sidewalks of Shadow Creek. The town had managed to stay relatively peaceful until now, but everyone knew that was about to change. What they didn't know was that the quiet widow watching from the shadows of Thompson's store had been waiting for this moment all along. Sheriff Thomas Hayes had seen enough trouble in his 15 years wearing the badge to know when a storm was brewing. As the Carson gang spread through Shadow Creek like a poison, he pulled the still-shaken Catherine McCall into his office, closing the door on the growing chaos outside. The old wood creaked with age, a sound nearly lost beneath the rising voices in the street. "All right, Cat," Hayes said, pouring 2 fingers of whiskey into a tin cup. "You want to tell me what got you looking like you've seen a ghost out there?" He pulled up a chair, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. Years of experience had taught him that women like McCall didn't spook easily, and anything that could rattle a veteran manhunter was worth hearing about. McCall drained the cup in one swallow, her hands still trembling. "That's exactly what I saw, Thomas. The ghost of Salvation Pass." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "That woman you call Morrison, her real name is Sarah Hawkins. 6 years ago, she was one of the most feared peacekeepers in the New Mexico Territory." The revelation hung in the air like gunsmoke. Hayes had heard whispers of the Salvation Pass massacre. Every lawman had. A remote homestead attacked by bandits. 15 people killed, including a marshal's entire family. The only survivor was a young woman who hunted down every last killer over the course of 2 years, earning the nickname Ghost for her ability to appear and disappear like a phantom. The stories said she died in 70, shot down in Santa Fe. "Stories say a lot of things," McCall continued, studying the empty cup. "A woman learns to recognize eyes like that, Thomas. Eyes that have seen too much death, caused too much of it. That's her, sure as I'm sitting here." Hayes refilled their cups, buying time to process this information. "Tell me everything you know about her, Cat. If we've got the ghost of Salvation Pass in our town, I need to know what we're dealing with." McCall's weathered face grew distant with memory. "I crossed paths with her once back in '69. Was tracking a murderer named Jack Burke through Apache country. Found Burke's camp one morning. What was left of it? Sarah had gotten there first. 3 men, all taken down so quick they hadn't even cleared leather. No wasted shots, no signs of struggle. Just cold, precise work. Outside, the Carson gang was making their presence known. Luke Carson, the youngest brother, had already started a fight at the saloon, his drunken whoops mixing with the sound of breaking glass and frightened piano notes. Matthew Carson was methodically visiting each business along Main Street, making what he called friendly suggestions about protection payments, his quiet voice and slight smile somehow making the threats even more menacing. James Carson himself remained mounted on his black stallion, watching the town with the calculating eyes of a snake, sizing up its prey. His reputation for cruelty was well earned. He'd once burned down an entire settlement just to catch one man who'd crossed him. The silver spurs on his boots caught the afternoon sun as he shifted in his saddle, studying every detail of Shadow Creek like a general planning a siege. If you're enjoying this story of justice and vengeance in the Old West, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. It means the world to us. Now, back to the story of how a quiet widow was about to remind the Carson gang why some legends are best left undisturbed. At Thompson's store, Mary found herself face to face with two of Carson's men. They were going through her inventory, helping themselves to whatever caught their fancy. One was tall and lean, with a knife scar running down his neck. The other shorter but heavily muscled with a cavalry hat pulled low over his eyes. "Boss wants to talk to you about your business arrangements," the tall one drawled, pushing merchandise off her shelves. The crash of breaking bottles punctuated his words. "Times are getting dangerous. Shame if something were to happen to this nice place." The bell above the door chimed softly. Sarah Morrison stood in the doorway, her black dress and shawl somehow filling the entire room with shadow. She didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there with those haunted eyes that McCall had recognized. The thin mountain sunlight streaming through the windows caught the silver streaks in her dark hair, remnants of whatever horrors had turned a young peacekeeper into the ghost of legend. "This ain't your concern, ma'am," the taller outlaw said, hand drifting toward his holster. "Best move along before things get unfriendly." Sarah Morrison didn't move. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the store. "The lady doesn't need any new arrangements." The tension in the store grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Mary had never heard Sarah string so many words together at once. There was something different about her voice now, an edge of steel beneath the quiet tone, like the whisper of a blade being drawn. The outlaws exchanged glances, sizing up the situation. They'd been told the town was soft, easy pickings. The silent widow in the doorway didn't fit that description. Something in her stance, the way she held herself perfectly still, sent warning signals through their trail-hardened instincts. "Maybe you didn't hear about the Carson gang," the shorter outlaw said, taking a step forward. His hand was twitching near his gun, but he hadn't committed to the draw. "We've killed folk for less than—" "I heard," Sarah interrupted, still eerily calm. "Killed that family in El Paso, burned down their home, shot the children first, made the parents watch." Her eyes never left them as she spoke, and in their depths Mary saw something that chilled her more than the outlaw's threats, a cold, calculating fury held in check by iron will. "That was you boys, wasn't it?" The way she said it sent chills down Mary's spine. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation, a promise. The outlaw's bravado faltered. They'd bullied plenty of townspeople before, but this was different. This was like standing before a coiled rattlesnake, knowing the strike could come at any moment. "We'll let the boss know you need some convincing," the taller one muttered, and they backed out of the store, trying to maintain their dignity while their instincts screamed at them to run. As soon as they were gone, Mary turned to thank Sarah, but the widow was already moving toward the door. She paused only long enough to say, "Bar your doors tonight, Miss Thompson. Keep your shotgun close." Then she was gone, leaving only the gentle chime of the bell in her wake. Back in the sheriff's office, McCall was still piecing together the story for Hayes. After Salvation Pass, Sarah became something else entirely. Not just a peacekeeper seeking justice, she was vengeance itself. They say she could track a man across bare rock and appear like a spirit in the night. Never used torture, never dragged it out. Just cold, methodical justice. "And you're certain it's her?" Hayes asked, watching through the window as Sarah crossed the street, her black dress rippling in the desert wind. "Look at how she moves," McCall replied. "That's a woman who's danced with death so many times they know each other's steps by heart. And if I'm right, Thomas, this town's about to see what happens when the ghost decides to haunt the living again." James Carson had noticed the exchange at the store. He sat straighter in his saddle, studying the quiet widow with newfound interest. Something about her bearing caught his attention, a familiar hint of danger that he'd learned never to ignore. "Matthew," he called to his brother, "send a couple boys out to that Morrison place tonight. Let's see what our friend's made of." A cruel smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Been a while since we had any real sport in these parts." The sun was setting over Shadow Creek, painting the sky in shades of blood red as darkness crept in. The townspeople hurried to their homes, locking doors and windows. They could feel it in their bones. Violence was coming to their quiet town. The peace they'd known was as fragile as morning frost, about to be shattered by the collision of old ghosts and new demons. And in the growing darkness, Sarah Morrison rode toward her ranch, the weight of her past settling around her shoulders like her black shawl. The silence she'd built around herself was about to be broken, and the ghost that Catherine McCall remembered was stirring back to life, ready to remind the world why some legends are best left undisturbed. The desert darkness fell thick and heavy over Shadow Creek Valley, broken only by scattered patches of starlight and a sickle moon hanging low on the horizon. At the Morrison Ranch, oil lamps burned in the windows of the old two-story house, casting long shadows across the yard where two horses stood saddled and ready. Inside, Sarah Morrison methodically cleaned her Colt Peacemaker, each movement precise and practiced. The weapon had been with her since Salvation Pass, its pearl grip worn smooth by years of use. She'd added a second gun to her arsenal since then, a Smith & Wesson Model 3 carried in a hidden pocket of her skirts. Both weapons were as much a part of her as her own hands. The sound came just after midnight, the distant crack of a breaking branch, followed by the nervous whicker of her horses. Sarah extinguished the lamps with practiced efficiency, moving through the darkness like she'd been born to it. From her window, she could make out 4 riders approaching through the mesquite, trying to use the scrubland for cover. They were good. She had to give them that, moving in pairs, keeping to the shadows, spreading out to cover all approaches to the house. But good wasn't enough when you were hunting a ghost. Down in Shadow Creek, Sheriff Hayes sat in his office with Catherine McCall, neither man even pretending to sleep. "Have you ever seen her work?" Hayes asked, breaking the long silence. McCall nodded slowly. "Once. Remember that business with the Burke boys up in New Mexico? 3 of them had a homesteader's family pinned down in their cabin. Sarah came out of a dust storm like Judgment Day itself. I've never seen anything like it. 3 shots, 3 bodies, all before they even knew she was there." She paused, taking a sip of coffee. "And now we've got her and the Carson gang in the same valley. Lord help us all." Back at the ranch, the first of Carson's men was already learning why they called her Ghost. The outlaw never even saw Sarah, just felt the cold press of steel against his neck and heard that whispered voice, "Drop the gun, slow and easy." His partner, 20 feet away, disappeared into the shadows with a muffled grunt. The night seemed to swallow him whole. "How many riders at the main camp?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible above the desert wind. "Go to hell," the outlaw spat. "Been there," Sarah replied. "Salvation Pass." 6 years ago. Now answer the question." Something in her tone made the outlaw's blood run cold. 30? Maybe 35. James has got men coming in from—" He never finished the sentence. Sarah's gun stock connected with precise force, and the man crumpled silently to the ground. Inside the house, the remaining 2 outlaws were discovering that entering a ghost's lair was poor strategy. They'd managed to pick the back door's lock only to find the ground floor empty, the furniture arranged to create an elaborate maze of shadows and blind corners. "Check upstairs," the leader whispered to his partner. "I'll clear down here." They never saw each other again. The first man made it halfway up the stairs before a floorboard creaked behind him. He spun, gun clearing leather, but the shadow that moved past him was faster. A hand clamped over his mouth while another trapped his gun hand. The struggle was brief and silent. His partner, searching the kitchen, heard nothing. The last outlaw found himself alone in the dark, his nerves fraying with each passing moment. The moonlight cast strange shadows through the windows, making every corner seem alive with movement. He was a veteran of a dozen raids, but something about this place set his nerves on edge. The silence felt wrong, heavy with menace. A whisper came from everywhere and nowhere. "Down and the children in El Paso, the ones you burned." Did they beg? The outlaw spun, firing blindly into the shadows. His muzzle flash destroyed his night vision. His last mistake. When they found him the next day, his gun was still smoking. Empty shells scattered across the floor. Dawn was still hours away when James Carson heard horses approaching their camp. He recognized the sound of Buck's distinctive gait, but something was wrong. And the big roan was moving too slow, and there was an extra set of hoofbeats. Luke Carson, half drunk by the fire, was the first to spot them. "That ain't right," he muttered, reaching for his gun. Two horses emerged from the darkness. Buck, their best scout's mount, was leading another horse. Tied across both saddles were the 4 men they'd sent to the Morrison ranch, all unconscious but alive. A note was pinned to the lead rider's shirt. "Next time, send better men or come yourself." James Carson crushed the note in his fist, his face twisted with rage. "Matthew," he called to his brother, "get some men into town. I want to know everything about this widow, where she came from, what she's running from, everything." "Already done," Matthew replied, emerging from the shadows. "Sent Jim and Carl to ask around. They should be back by morning." But morning would bring its own revelations as the first light crept over the mountains. Catherine McCall was already riding out of town, heading east. She'd seen what was coming, and she knew where she needed to go. There were other ghosts out there, other legends from the Salvation Pass days, and Shadow Creek would need every one of them before this was over. In town, Mary Thompson opened her store to find a small package on the counter, though all her doors and windows were still locked. Inside was a box of ammunition for her shotgun and a simple note: "Stay ready." And at her ranch, Sarah Morrison watched the sunrise from her porch, counting the hours until the real violence would begin. The 4 men she'd sent back were just a message, a reminder that some predators are best left undisturbed. But she knew James Carson's type. The message wouldn't be enough. The ghost of Salvation Pass was about to ride again, and this time there would be nowhere for the wicked to hide. The morning brought more than just sunlight to Shadow Creek. It brought whispers. Word of the night's events at the Morrison Ranch spread through town like wildfire, growing more elaborate with each telling. By noon, half the town claimed Sarah had single-handedly fought off a dozen men, while the other half swore it was closer to 20. Dr. Elizabeth Cooper's office had become an impromptu gathering place as she treated the 4 returned raiders. None had life-threatening injuries, but each bore the precise brutality of their encounter: dislocated shoulders, cracked ribs, carefully placed bruises, the kind of damage that spoke of calculated violence rather than blind rage. "Never saw her coming," one of them muttered through swollen lips. "Just this whisper in the dark, then nothing." The others nodded in agreement, their eyes haunted by more than just physical pain. Matthew Carson stood in the corner of the doctor's office, his cold eyes taking in every detail. Unlike his brothers, Matthew had learned to read men like books, and these injuries told a story he didn't like. Each blow had been precisely placed, designed to incapacitate without killing. This wasn't the work of some lucky widow. This was professional violence. "Tell me again," he pressed. "Exactly what happened when you entered the house." The oldest of the 4, a scarred veteran named Tucker, shook his head. "It was like trying to fight a shadow, Mr. Carson. The place was rigged. Furniture moved to create blind spots, rugs pulled back to make the floorboards creak. She knew exactly where we'd go, how we'd move, turned the whole house into a trap." At the saloon, Luke Carson was drowning his frustration in whiskey, his anger growing with each drink. "Should have burned the whole damn place down," he growled to no one in particular. "That's what James would have done in the old days." A quiet voice behind him made him freeze. "Your brother's smarter than that." Luke turned to find Sarah Morrison standing at the bar, calmly pouring herself a drink. The saloon fell silent, the piano player's fingers hovering motionlessly above the keys. "Got some nerve showing your face in town," Luke snarled, his hand inching toward his gun. Sarah sipped her whiskey, seemingly unconcerned. "Just here for supplies. Unless you'd rather continue last night's discussion." The tension in the room was unbearable. Everyone had heard about the night raid by now, and they watched the exchange with a mixture of fear and fascination. Luke Carson's reputation with a gun was well known, but there was something about Sarah's calm demeanor that made even hardened men nervous. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Sarah asked softly. "Your brother James is the thinker. You've always been more impulsive." Luke's face twisted with rage. "How do you—" "I know all about the Carson gang," Sarah interrupted. "The bank in Santa Fe, the massacre at Fort Stockton, the bounties on your heads that keep growing." She set her glass down with deliberate care. "I even know about that business in El Paso, the part that didn't make the wanted posters." Luke's hand had almost reached his gun when a new voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, little brother." James Carson stood in the doorway, his presence commanding immediate attention. He walked into the saloon with the confident stride of a man used to owning any room he entered. "Mrs. Morrison and I need to have a private conversation." "Your men need better training," Sarah remarked, still not turning around. "They make too much noise in the dark." A ghost of a smile played across James's features. "Seems to me you know a lot about moving in the dark, almost like you've had practice." He pulled up a bar stool, keeping a careful distance. "I've been asking around about you. Interesting thing, nobody seems to know where you came from. Just appeared one day. Like a ghost." The word hung in the air between them. In the street outside, Matthew Carson was positioning men at strategic points, covering every exit. Inside, Luke's trigger finger twitched with barely contained violence. "Ghosts don't bleed," Sarah replied quietly. "Everyone bleeds," James countered. "Even legends. Even the famous Ghost of Salvation Pass." The name dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. Around the saloon, men who'd heard the stories found themselves instinctively backing away. The Ghost of Salvation Pass was more than just a legend. She was a nightmare that still haunted men's dreams. "That ghost died in Santa Fe," Sarah said, finally turning to face James. Their eyes met across the smoky room, two predators taking each other's measure. "Did she?" James's smile widened. "Because I heard a story once about a woman who lost everything at a place called Salvation Pass. Lost her husband, her home, everything but her guns and her skill with them. They say she spent 2 years hunting down every man responsible. 32 kills, all of them clean, professional. No witnesses, no warnings, just bodies left in the dark." Sarah's face remained impassive, but something flickered in her eyes. A cold light that made even James Carson pause. "Stay away from my ranch," Sarah said softly. "Stay away from this town. You've got 2 days to ride out. Take your business elsewhere." James laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Or what? You'll add us to your count?" "I'll add you to my ghosts." The threat hung in the air as Sarah finished her whiskey and walked out of the saloon, past Luke's trembling gun hand and through the gauntlet of Carson's men. Each of them found themselves avoiding her gaze, their hands strangely reluctant to stray too close to their weapons. As the saloon doors swung shut behind her, James Carson's smile faded. "Matthew," he called to his brother, "send word to all our friends in the territory. I want every gun we can hire. If she wants to play ghost, we'll give her a proper haunting." The war for Shadow Creek was about to begin, and the Ghost of Salvation Pass had just thrown down the gauntlet. Word would travel fast in the territories, carried on horseback, and whispered in saloons. Within 24 hours of James Carson's call, killers would begin arriving in Shadow Creek. Hardened gunmen drawn by the promise of blood money and the chance to test themselves against a legend. But Catherine McCall had been busy too. Her urgent telegram had reached its destination, a remote ranch in Wyoming where other ghosts from the past had found their own kind of peace. The message was simple. The ghost rides again. Shadow Creek. Come quick. Back at her ranch, Sarah was making preparations of her own. Those who rode past reported seeing her methodically working on her property, mending fences, tending cattle, seemingly unconcerned with the gathering storm. But closer observation would have revealed subtle changes, sight lines being cleared, approaches to the house being modified, ammunition being strategically placed. Mary Thompson noticed something else when Sarah came in for supplies. Extra coffee, bacon, and ammunition. Enough for several people. "Expecting company?" she asked carefully. "Old friends," Sarah replied softly, her eyes distant. In town, Matthew Carson was orchestrating their strategy with cold precision. He divided their forces into teams, each assigned to specific approaches to Sarah's ranch. "She's one woman," Matthew told his brother James. "No matter how good she is, she can't watch every direction at once." James nodded, studying the crude map they'd drawn of the property. "What about the town?" "Most folk'll stay out of it," Matthew replied. "Sheriff Hayes has got no deputies to speak of except that green kid Wilson. Even if he wanted to interfere, he couldn't." Luke Carson, nursing both a hangover and his wounded pride, spat on the floor. "Should have killed her in the saloon yesterday. And miss all the fun?" James smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No, little brother. When we take down the ghost of Salvation Pass, I want it done right. I want stories told about it." As evening approached, Dr. Elizabeth Cooper was surprised by a visitor, Sarah Morrison, carrying a leather medical bag. "Belonged to the doctor at Salvation Pass," Sarah explained quietly. "I've carried it ever since. Thought you might need it soon." Cooper examined the bag's contents, surgical instruments, bandages, and medicines, all meticulously maintained. "You're expecting casualties?" "I'm expecting war," Sarah replied. "Best be prepared." The doctor studied her patient-turned-warrior carefully. "The men they're bringing in, they're not common thugs." "No," Sarah agreed. "They're professionals, killers. Men who've made their living by the gun." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "But they've never hunted a ghost before." At the saloon, the newly arrived gunmen were getting restless. They'd heard the stories about the Ghost of Salvation Pass, but many dismissed them as tall tales. Miguel El Coyote Vega, his dark eyes glittering with amusement, entertained the crowd with his own theory. "I heard she died in Santa Fe," the Mexican gunfighter declared. "Shot in the back by a man she wronged. These stories about her hunting men in the dark, cuentos de hadas, fairy tales to scare children and fool gringos. Tell that to the 4 men she sent back last night," someone muttered. Vega laughed. "4 common banditos surprised in the dark. Tomorrow we will see how this ghost fares against real killers." But not everyone shared his confidence. William Deadeye Davis, a veteran gunfighter with 13 notches on his ivory-handled Colts, sat quietly in the corner, watching and listening. He'd crossed paths with the ghost once, years ago in New Mexico, had seen firsthand what happened to men who underestimated her. The memories still gave him nightmares. As night fell, Mary Thompson made her way to Sarah's ranch despite the dangers. The shopkeeper found her on the porch, watching the sunset. "My Robert," she said without preamble, "before he died, he kept a cache of weapons. Civil War supplies hidden in a cave up in the hills. Never told anyone but me about it." Sarah studied her carefully. "Why tell me now?" "Because I know what's coming," Mary replied. "And whatever else you are, Mrs. Morrison, you're a good woman. Robert would have wanted you to have them." Later that night, Sheriff Hayes made his own visit to the ranch. He found Sarah cleaning her guns by lamplight, each movement precise and practiced. "I can't help you officially," Hayes said. "Too many of them, and the law's stretched thin out here." "I know. But I can tell you they're planning to move at dawn. Matthew Carson's got them organized in teams. They'll come from all directions, trying to overwhelm you with numbers." Sarah nodded, never looking up from her work. "You should get your deputy out of town tomorrow. Take him on patrol somewhere far from here." "Already planned to," Hayes replied. "God help us all, Sarah. Or whatever name you're really using." As the sheriff rode away, other figures were moving in the darkness. Catherine McCall's message had reached its mark and old debts were about to be paid. The ghost of Salvation Pass wouldn't face tomorrow's storm alone. In town, James Carson gathered his killers for final instructions. Tomorrow, they would end the legend of the ghost, but as they plotted and planned, none of them noticed the strange lights up in the hills behind Sarah's ranch, or the shadowy figures moving through the night, drawn by an old oath and the call of vengeance long delayed. Dr. Cooper, preparing her clinic for what she feared would come, received an unexpected visitor, Deadeye Davis. The gunfighter's hands trembled as he poured himself a drink from her medical supply. "You ever see someone who's faced her and lived, Doc?" he asked quietly. "The eyes ain't right after, like they've seen something that ain't natural." He took a long swallow. "Saw her work once, in New Mexico. 3 men, all killers, all fast with a gun. She appeared out of nowhere, like smoke on the wind. When it was over, weren't nothing left but cooling bodies and spent shells." The doctor studied him carefully. "You're afraid of her?" "Ain't afraid of dying, Doc. Been expecting that since I first strapped on a gun. But there's dying, and then there's being hunted by something that ain't quite human no more." At the local church, Father Michael Thomas found Sarah lighting a candle. "Praying for salvation?" he asked gently. "No, Father," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Just remembering what I'm fighting for." She turned to face him, and in the candlelight, he saw something in her eyes that made him step back. Not evil, but something ancient and terrible, like an avenging angel from the Old Testament. Matthew Carson, meanwhile, was positioning his men around the town. 50 gunmen in all, some Carson gang regulars, others hired killers drawn by reputation and reward. He'd placed sharpshooters on the rooftops, scouts at every approach, runners ready to carry messages between groups. "It's a good plan," James observed, studying the preparations. "Better than what we had at El Paso." "El Paso was different," Matthew replied. "We were hunting scared farmers. This is hunting a hunter." In her store, Mary Thompson was holding a secret meeting with other townspeople. "We can't just stand by," she insisted. "This is our town too." "And what would you have us do?" asked Benjamin Wade, the blacksmith. "Most of us ain't never fired a shot in anger." "Sometimes," Mary replied, "it ain't about shooting. It's about choosing sides." The night grew deeper, and an unseasonable fog began rolling down from the hills, thick and white as burial shrouds. The hired killers, watching it creep through the streets of Shadow Creek, felt their nerves begin to fray. "Just weather," El Coyote Vega insisted, but his hand kept straying to his gun. Up at her ranch, Sarah stood on her porch watching the fog gather. 6 years ago at Salvation Pass, she'd been a different woman, a marshal's wife with dreams of a peaceful life. Tomorrow, she would remind them all why that woman had died and what had risen in her place. Dawn came to Shadow Creek Valley like a held breath, the fog clinging to the ground in ghostly tendrils. The sun hadn't yet crested the eastern mountains when James Carson's army of killers began moving into position. They spread out in a wide circle around Sarah's ranch, their movements precise and coordinated under Matthew's careful planning. El Coyote Vega led the first team approaching from the south, his dark serape blending with the pre-dawn shadows. The Thompson brothers took the eastern approach, while Deadeye Davis's group crept in from the west, the veteran gunslinger's hands steady despite his private fears. Matthew Carson himself commanded the northern team, with James holding a dozen men in reserve, ready to strike wherever an opportunity presented itself. But something was wrong. Davis felt it first, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the instinct that had kept him alive through countless gunfights. The ranch was too quiet. No movement, no smoke from the chimney, not even a dog's bark. "Hold up," he whispered to his men. "Something ain't right." Before anyone could respond, a voice came from everywhere and nowhere, carrying on the morning wind. "Last chance to ride away." It was Sarah's voice, but it seemed to come from multiple directions, making it impossible to pinpoint. Several of the hired guns jumped, their nerves already fraying. "Show yourself, Ghost!" Vega shouted from his position. Or are you only brave in the dark? The answer came in the form of a single gunshot. One of Vega's men pitched forward, clutching his shoulder, wounded but alive. A warning shot. That's one. Sarah's voice drifted through the mist. I won't aim to wound twice. James Carson's voice cut through the tension. Take her. The valley erupted in gunfire, bullets whizzing through the morning air, chewing splinters from the ranch house and surrounding buildings. But return fire came from unexpected quarters, the barn, the corral, positions that shouldn't have been defendable by one woman. She's not alone, Matthew shouted. Watch the high ground. He was right. Figures had appeared on the ridgeline above the ranch. 5 riders, their long dusters marking them as cut from the same cloth as Sarah. Catherine McCall's message had found its mark. Who the hell are they? Luke Carson demanded, watching through his spyglass from the reserve position. James's face had gone pale. The other ghosts, he whispered. The ones who rode with her after Salvation Pass. The battle devolved into chaos. The Thompson brothers' team tried to rush the barn only to be caught in devastating crossfire. 3 men fell before they could reach cover. Vega's group made it to the corral but found themselves pinned down by precise fire from multiple directions. Deadeye Davis had seen enough. Fall back, he shouted to his men. It's a killing ground. But retreat wasn't as simple as advancing had been. Every route of escape seemed covered. Every movement drew fire. The ghost of Salvation Pass had turned her entire ranch into an elaborate trap, using the terrain and pre-positioned defenses to maximum effect. Matthew Carson watched his careful plan unravel through gritted teeth. Push forward, he commanded. We still have the numbers. A quiet voice behind him made his blood run cold. Numbers don't matter in the dark, Matthew. He spun, drawing his gun, but Sarah was faster. Matthew found himself staring down the barrel of that legendary peacemaker, his own gun clattering to the ground. 6 years, Sarah said softly. I've waited 6 years to meet you. You were there at Salvation Pass. Gave the orders that night. Matthew's eyes widened with recognition. We thought you were dead. I was, Sarah replied. What you're fighting now is just the ghost. Up on the ridge, the 5 riders began moving down toward the battle. Their leader, a graying woman with a face weathered by years of violence, raised her hand. The others spread out, each taking prearranged positions. The legend of the Ghost of Salvation Pass was about to grow even larger, and Shadow Creek would never be the same. James Carson, watching the disaster unfold, made his decision. Luke, get our reserves up there, surround the house. But Luke Carson never got the chance to relay that order. A bullet kicked up dust at his feet, followed by a familiar whisper in the wind. The boy stays out. The morning mist was beginning to burn off, revealing the true extent of the battlefield. Bodies lay scattered across the ranch yard, some dead, others wounded. Dr. Cooper, watching from her office window in town, could already tell it would be a long day. El Coyote Vega, his previous bravado forgotten, tried to rally his remaining men. Es solo una mujer. One woman cannot. The words died in his throat as Sarah stepped out of the shadows behind his position. The legendary gunwoman moved like smoke, her black dress making her seem part of the darkness itself. 2 of Vega's men reached for their guns. Both were on the ground before their hands found steel. You asked to see the ghost, Sarah said quietly. Here I am. Up at the main house, James Carson was finally beginning to understand the true gravity of his mistake. He'd brought an army to kill a legend, only to find that legends sometimes travel in packs. The 5 riders from the ridge were now moving systematically through his men, each of them displaying the same deadly efficiency as Sarah herself. Deadeye Davis, perhaps the only one among them who had truly understood what they were facing, threw down his gun belt. I'm done, he announced. Any man with sense would be. The morning was not yet half over, and already the legend of the Ghost of Salvation Pass was growing. But for Sarah Morrison, this was only the beginning. Somewhere in the chaos, Matthew Carson had slipped away, and James was still out there, rallying his remaining men. Wasn't going to let you face this alone, Not after Salvation Pass, the gray-haired woman from the ridge said, approaching Sarah. Her name was Hannah Hawkins, once a legendary marshal herself. We all came, every one of us who rode with you back then. The other riders were spreading out, each taking strategic positions. They moved with the coordinated precision of people who'd fought together before, who'd learned to trust each other with their lives. There was Rebecca Swift Johnson, the Apache tracker, Margaret Iron Ross, former Army Scout, Elizabeth Shadow Chen, whose family had been killed by raiders, and Catherine McCall herself, returned just in time for the fight. In town, James Carson was regrouping his remaining forces. More than half his men were dead, wounded, or had simply fled after witnessing the morning's carnage. Matthew had disappeared, and Luke was growing increasingly unstable, his fear masked by false bravado and whiskey. Send word to every camp and hideout within riding distance, James ordered one of his men. Promise them whatever they want. I need more guns here by nightfall. They won't come, a quiet voice said. Everyone turned to see Deadeye Davis walking into the saloon, his gun belt conspicuously absent. Word's already spreading about what happened this morning. No one's going to ride against the Justice Riders, not for any price. James's face twisted with rage. They're just women. No, Davis replied, pouring himself a drink with trembling hands. There's something else out there, something that should have stayed buried in the past. At the sheriff's office, Hayes was getting the full story from McCall. After Salvation Pass, the old law woman explained, Sarah didn't just hunt the killers. She found others like her, women who'd lost everything, who'd seen justice fail. Each of them had their own ghosts to lay to rest. And they all rode together? Hayes asked. For 2 years, McCall replied. We weren't vigilantes. We worked within the law when we could, but when the law failed, her voice trailed off. They called us the Justice Riders. 6 women who'd seen too much darkness, who'd decided to fight it on its own terms. Back at the ranch, several of Sarah's allies had taken defensive positions around the property. Hannah Hawkins, watching through her spyglass, spotted movement in town. They're not done yet, she called out. Carson's rallying his men for another push. Sarah nodded, checking her ammunition. He won't quit, not while he can still throw bodies at us. Just like his brother Matthew, Rebecca Swift Johnson added, her Apache-trained eyes scanning the horizon. Always thinking they could solve everything with numbers and brute force, Margaret Iron Ross approached, her cavalry training evident in her bearing. Speaking of Matthew, he's disappeared, slipped away during the chaos. He'll be back, Sarah replied softly. The coward always returns when he thinks he has the advantage. In town, James Carson was indeed planning his next move, but with a desperate edge now. He'd lost too many men to maintain his usual calculating approach. Luke, he called to his youngest brother, take 10 men and some oil barrels. If we can't shoot them out, we'll burn them out. Elizabeth Shadow Chen, positioned in the church tower with her rifle, spotted Luke's group leaving town. Sarah, she signaled with a mirror flash. They're carrying fire. Down in Mary Thompson's store, a secret meeting was taking place. The shopkeeper had gathered several townspeople in her basement. We can't just watch them burn the valley, she insisted. Mrs. Morrison, Sarah, she's been protecting us all along. But what can we do against gunfighters? Benjamin Wade asked. Mary pulled out a collection of old mining equipment. We might not be killers, but we know this valley, every cave, every tunnel from the old silver mines. And Carson's men don't. Catherine McCall, observing the Carson gang's movements from her position, noticed something else. More riders were approaching from the east, but not the reinforcements James Carson had hoped for. These were lawmen, sheriffs, and deputies from neighboring counties, drawn by the sound of battle and the chance to finally end the Carson gang's reign of terror. Your message reached more than just us, she told Sarah during a lull in the fighting. Seems the laws finally decided to take a stand. Sarah's response was interrupted by the sound of approaching hooves. Matthew Carson had returned, leading a group of men up from the old silver mines, a route he thought would be secret. But Mary Thompson's knowledge of the valley had already warned the Justice Riders. "Your brother never was very original," Sarah commented to James, who was watching from behind a hastily constructed barricade in town. Her voice seemed to come from the very air itself, making several of his men jump. "Same trick he tried at Salvation Pass. Coming up through the low ground, thinking surprise would save him. The trap was sprung perfectly. Matthew's men found themselves caught between Margaret Ross's rifle fire from above and Elizabeth Chen's deadly accuracy from the flanks. Matthew himself barely escaped, his hat shot from his head as he fled back into the mines. Luke Carson's fire attack met a similar fate. The townspeople, led by Mary Thompson, had flooded the approach routes from the old water towers, turning the ground to mud and rendering the oil barrels useless. More importantly, they'd shown James Carson that he wasn't just fighting 6 legendary women. He was fighting an entire town. "It's over, James," Sarah's voice carried across the battlefield. "Your men are dead or running. The law's coming. Even your brothers have abandoned you to save themselves." "Nothing's over," James shouted back, his composure finally cracking. "I'll burn this whole valley down before I let a ghost beat me." "You already tried that once," Sarah replied, her voice turning colder. "At Salvation Pass. You burned my home, killed my husband, left me for dead in the ashes. But fire has a way of forging things, James, of turning them into something harder, something deadlier." The sun was directly overhead now, and Shadow Creek held its breath, waiting to see how many more would die before the ghosts of Salvation Pass were finally laid to rest. Thunder rolled across Shadow Creek Valley, though there wasn't a cloud in the sky. The sound of approaching riders, lawmen coming to join the fight. James Carson, hearing the noise, knew his time was running out. His carefully constructed empire was crumbling around him, destroyed by the ghost he thought he'd burned away years ago. "Luke," he shouted to his younger brother, "get to the church, use the height. Matthew, take what's left of our men," and he turned to find Matthew gone, slipped away like a snake in the grass. Even now, at the end, the middle Carson brother was thinking only of saving himself. In the church tower, Elizabeth Chen spotted Luke's movement. "He's heading for my position," she signaled to Sarah. "Want me to take the shot?" "No," Sarah's reply came via mirror flash. "He's mine. All 3 of them are mine." Hannah Hawkins, who had fought beside Sarah since the early days, understood. "Some ghosts you have to lay to rest yourself," she murmured. The townspeople had barricaded themselves in key buildings, following Mary Thompson's leadership. They'd created a network of safe routes through the town using their knowledge of the old silver mining tunnels, allowing them to move supplies and information right under the Carson gang's feet. Dr. Cooper had transformed her clinic into a field hospital, treating wounded from both sides. "I don't understand." One of Carson's hired guns groaned as she extracted a bullet from his shoulder. "We had the numbers, the guns, everything." "You had weapons," the doctor replied calmly. "They had purpose. There's a difference." Up in the hills, Catherine McCall intercepted Matthew Carson trying to slip away toward the territorial border. "Running again, Matthew?" she called out, her rifle trained on his chest. "Just like at Salvation Pass? Letting others do your killing while you keep your hands clean?" The middle Carson brother froze, then slowly raised his hands. "You don't understand," he stammered. "It was supposed to be a simple job. Just clear out some homesteaders for the railroad. We didn't know she was a marshal's wife." "No." Sarah's voice came from behind him. "You didn't know a lot of things. Didn't know I was tracking fugitives that night. Didn't know I'd come home early to find my house in flames. My husband." Her voice caught for just a moment. "You didn't know that some fires forge instead of destroy." In town, Luke Carson had reached the church, but found it wasn't the sanctuary he'd hoped for. The townspeople had already barricaded it, and from every window and doorway came the deadly accurate fire of the Justice Riders. He retreated, running blindly, only to find himself in the town square, exposed from all sides. James Carson, watching his youngest brother's desperate flight, made his final play. "Sarah!" he roared into the afternoon air. "Face me! Face me like a real gunfighter, not some ghost in the shadows. Or are you afraid?" The square fell silent. Even the gunfire from the outskirts of town seemed to fade away. Sarah Morrison stepped out of the shadows, her black dress rippling in the hot breeze, her eyes fixed on the man who had destroyed her life and created the legend of the ghost. "I stopped being afraid the night you burned my world away," she said softly. "Fear burns too, James. Burns until there's nothing left but purpose." The lawmen were getting closer now, their horses' hooves creating a rolling thunder that seemed to shake the very ground. But for Sarah Morrison, for the ghost of Salvation Pass, there was only this moment, only these men who had taken everything from her and forced her to become something else, something that haunted other men's nightmares. "Last chance, James," she said, her voice carrying across the square. "Surrender to the law or surrender to the ghost. But this ends today, one way or another." James Carson's hand moved toward his gun, his face twisted into a snarl. "Ghosts can't kill what they can't catch, woman. And this time I'll make sure you stay dead." The moment hung in the air like smoke after gunfire. James Carson facing Sarah Morrison in Shadow Creek's town square, 6 years of vengeance condensed into a single heartbeat. The setting sun painted the buildings in shades of blood red, casting long shadows across the dusty ground. "You know something funny, Sarah?" James called out, his confidence wavering beneath forced bravado. "I don't even remember your husband's name. Just another obstacle cleared for progress, for civilization." "His name was Thomas," Sarah replied, her voice as soft as a rattler's warning. "Thomas Morrison. He was a good man, a marshal who believed in justice, not just law. You should remember his name, James. It's the reason you're about to die." Behind James, Luke Carson was trembling. Whether from fear or whiskey, no one could tell. Matthew, still held at gunpoint by Catherine McCall, watched from the shadows of an alley, his face pale with the knowledge of what was coming. The Justice Riders had taken up positions around the square, Hannah Hawkins on the hotel balcony, her rifle ready, Elizabeth Chen in the shadows of the church, Rebecca Johnson on the general store's roof, and Margaret Ross guarding the escape routes. But they all knew this moment belonged to Sarah. "Marshal Morrison's widow," James spat. "Think you're some kind of avenging angel? You're just a woman playing at being a legend. Ghost of Salvation Pass." He laughed, but there was a brittle edge to it. "I've killed ghosts before." "No, James." Sarah's eyes seemed to darken. "You've killed people, flesh and blood that burns and bleeds. But I'm what rose from those ashes. The ghost you created." The tension was unbearable. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. In the clinic, Dr. Cooper paused in her work, sensing the moment. Mary Thompson and the townspeople watched from their barricaded positions, witnessing history being written in their streets. Luke Carson's nerve broke first. He drew, fast and wild, his bullet whining harmlessly past Sarah's ear. Her response was a single shot, precise and deadly. Luke fell, his gun unfired, a look of surprise frozen on his face as he discovered that ghosts could indeed kill. Matthew made his move then, trying to use the distraction to break free from McCall's custody. He managed 2 steps before Sarah's second shot took him in the chest. The architect of the Salvation Pass massacre fell face first into the dirt, his clever plans and smooth words silenced forever. Then it was just Sarah and James the way it was always meant to be, the ghost and the man who'd created her facing each other in the dying light. "Your brothers died quick," Sarah said softly. "That's more mercy than you showed my Thomas." James Carson's face twisted with rage. His hand dropped to his gun, renowned as one of the fastest draws in the territory. But Sarah Morrison wasn't just fast. She was a ghost, a legend, vengeance given form. Her peacemaker seemed to materialize in her hand, The sound of the shot rolled across Shadow Creek like judgment itself. James Carson, terror of the territories, scourge of honest folk, looked down in disbelief at the spreading red stain on his chest. "How?" he gasped, falling to his knees. "You couldn't. You were just a woman." Sarah stepped closer, her black dress rippling in the evening breeze. "I was," she agreed. "Until you killed her that night at Salvation Pass. Should have made sure I was dead, James. Should have checked the ashes for ghosts." James Carson, the last of the brothers, toppled forward into the dust. The legend of the Carson gang died with him, ended by the very ghost they'd created. The approaching lawmen finally reached the town's edge, led by sheriffs and marshals from 3 territories. They found Shadow Creek quiet, the street littered with the proof that legends sometimes do more than haunt. Sometimes they bring justice. Hannah Hawkins approached Sarah, who stood motionless, her gun still smoking. "It's done," Hannah said softly. "The ghosts can rest now." Sarah Morrison looked at her old friend, and for the first time in 6 years, there were tears in her eyes. Can they, Hannah? Or do ghosts just find new haunts? A week after what would become known as the Shadow Creek Showdown, the town was still counting its dead. 27 men had fallen in the battle, including the Carson brothers, with twice that many nursing wounds in Dr. Cooper's clinic. The final tally told a story of violence that would be whispered about in saloons across the territory for years to come. Sheriff Hayes stood in his office, staring at the stack of reports on his desk. The territorial governor would want details, and the bounties on the Carson gang alone would keep the clerks busy for months. Catherine McCall sat across from him, helping to sort through the aftermath of justice. Interesting thing about the wounds, Hayes mused, reviewing Dr. Cooper's notes. Most of the survivors were hit in the shoulders or legs. Even in the thick of it, Sarah and her riders were choosing their shots. McCall nodded. "That's how we worked after Salvation Pass, too. Clean kills for the worst ones, wounds for those who might learn from a second chance." She shuffled through some papers. "Remember that young gun who surrendered early? Found him helping at the clinic yesterday, said he's looking for honest work now." "Sometimes mercy teaches better lessons than violence," Hayes agreed. Deputy Wilson had spent the morning collecting statements from witnesses, each account adding new layers to the legend. "Some swear they saw Mrs. Morrison in 2 places at once during the fight," he reported. "Others say bullets couldn't touch her, just passed right through like she really was a ghost." "Let them talk," Hayes replied. "Sometimes a legend protects better than a badge." In town, life was slowly returning to normal, though changes were evident everywhere. Mary Thompson had reopened her store, though customers noticed she kept her shotgun closer now. The townspeople walked taller, prouder, knowing they'd stood together against terror and won. Deadeye Davis, who'd survived by surrendering early, had found an unexpected purpose helping Dr. Cooper tend to the wounded. His gunfighter's hands proved steady, with bandages and medicine. "Never thought I'd end up on this side of things," he told the doctor one evening. "Spent my whole life being the cause of wounds, not healing them." The doctor had smiled knowingly. Redemption comes in strange forms out here. Up at her ranch, Sarah Morrison had returned to her quiet routine, though things had subtly changed. The townspeople's whispers had a different tone now, respect instead of suspicion, gratitude instead of fear. They'd seen what lay beneath the silence, and they understood it better. Hannah Hawkins and the other justice riders had departed as quietly as they had arrived, melting back into the territories like the ghosts they were. But Hannah had left Sarah with a warning. "Word spreading. Other outlaws will hear about Carson. Some will be smart enough to stay away." "And the others?" Sarah had asked. "The others will come, testing the legend, looking to make their own names by challenging the ghost." Elizabeth Chen, last to leave, had added her own counsel. "The wolf that hunts alone dies alone. Remember you have sisters, even in the shadows." Sheriff Hayes, before returning to his rounds, had offered Sarah a badge. "Territory could use more people like you," he'd said. "Official capacity this time." Sarah had declined with a slight shake of her head. Some ghosts serve better in the shadows. Dr. Cooper, tending to the last of the wounded, had perhaps understood best. Women like Sarah, she told McCall, they're the price of civilization in a wild land. We sleep safe because they stand ready to face the darkness on our behalf. The real heroes are the ones who carry that burden quietly. As autumn settled over Shadow Creek, people slept easier knowing their guardian angel wore a black dress and carried a peacemaker. The legend of the ghost would live on, but the truth was both simpler and more profound. In a land where justice was often as elusive as morning mist, sometimes it took a ghost to remind people that consequences still existed for evil deeds. They say Sarah Morrison still rides those territories, a quiet widow until darkness calls, and in saloons across the frontier, men speak in whispers of the ghost of Salvation Pass, each telling making the legend grow. Some stay away, warned by wisdom or fear. Others come, drawn by the chance to make their own legends. But they all learn the same truth. Some ghosts are best left undisturbed, and some legends never die. If you enjoyed this tale of justice and vengeance, make sure you're subscribed to our channel for more stories from the wild frontier. Until next time, remember, the quietest souls often carry the deadliest secrets.